January 12, 1945. A dense morning mist clings to the swollen riverbanks of Leyte, Philippines. The air hums with distant artillery, punctuated by the sharp crack of rifle fire and the low rumble of American tanks advancing through muddy trails. Soldiers on both sides move cautiously, boots sinking into the wet earth, eyes scanning for movement, ears straining for the slightest hint of danger. Smoke curls from smoldering ruins of villages, the scent of wet timber and cordite mingling in the cold air. A bridge arches over the river, a lifeline for Japanese reinforcements and supplies. Yet, to the American engineers observing from concealed positions, it is more than a crossing. It is a weapon waiting to be unleashed. Logs and steel beams are rigged, explosives concealed, structural weaknesses calculated with precision. The Japanese commanders, confident in the safety of their defensive lines, cannot imagine the ingenuity being prepared against them. In a war dominated by guns, tanks, and planes, the simple form of a bridge becomes an instrument of chaos. When the Americans strike, it will rewrite the battlefield, turning a passage into a trap and leaving Japanese officers stunned at the audacity of the tactic. This river, this bridge, today, it becomes the fulcrum of a deadly innovation. By late 1941, the Pacific had become a vast chessboard of strategic ambitions, dominated by the imperial designs of Japan and the industrial might of the United States. Japan's early victories had been swift and shocking. The capture of Malaya, the fall of Singapore, and the seizure of the Philippines in the opening months of the war. Japanese military planners had relied on speed, surprise, and overwhelming force, trusting that their carefully honed army would dominate any terrain encountered. Infrastructure, roads, railways, and especially bridges, was viewed primarily as a conduit for moving troops and supplies. To Japanese commanders, bridges were neutral instruments of war, not tools to be exploited beyond their conventional function. Across the Pacific, American forces faced a stark reality. The United States had entered the war with its military scattered, underprepared for island campaigns, and limited in troop experience against entrenched Japanese defenses. Yet, it possessed a hidden advantage: engineering ingenuity. American military engineers had been developing methods to adapt standard equipment for unconventional uses, from portable pontoon bridges to explosive demolitions designed not just to destroy, but to manipulate the battlefield. The U.S. Army and Navy had begun experimenting with turning the environment itself into a weapon, exploiting terrain that Japanese commanders considered predictable or secure. By 1943, as the Allies began regaining territory in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, the war had shifted from grand, sweeping invasions to methodical campaigns across rivers, jungles, and mountains. The island's narrow passages, combined with dense vegetation and frequent waterways, turned every crossing into a potential choke point. American forces recognized that conventional tactics, frontal assaults, artillery bombardments, or aerial strafing were often insufficient against Japanese fortifications. Here, military engineering could become decisive. Bridges, which Japanese commanders assumed were safe for transport and supply, could be transformed into tools of disruption. The Japanese mindset, conditioned by rapid victories, focused on speed and fortification rather than anticipating inventive battlefield tactics. Reports from the front emphasized the reliability of defensive positions along rivers and the security of key bridges. Intelligence officers rarely expected that the Allies would weaponize the very infrastructure meant to support movement. The combination of American industrial capacity, ingenuity, and patience in planning created a unique advantage: the ability to transform predictable terrain into a stage for tactical surprise. By the time U.S. forces approached the islands of Leyte and Mindoro, bridge-centric operations were no longer theoretical exercises. Engineers and commanders meticulously surveyed each river crossing, noting load capacities, structural weaknesses, and patterns of Japanese traffic. Bridges became more than conduits. They became instruments of control. Explosives were concealed within beams, pontoons rigged to collapse on command, and diversionary constructions designed to mislead the enemy. Japanese patrols, unaware of the sophistication of these preparations, continued to rely on the bridges for movement, unknowingly marching into zones that had been carefully transformed into weapons. Even at the tactical level, American planners studied human behavior. Japanese officers often underestimated the ingenuity of their opponents, relying on predictability and routine. This psychological edge, anticipating overconfidence and exploiting it, would prove just as decisive as any explosive charge. The juxtaposition was stark. A structure that had symbolized safe passage for Japanese troops now embodied vulnerability and danger. As winter rains swelled rivers across the Philippines, American engineers refined their methods. They studied currents, calculated collapse patterns, and synchronized timing for maximum disruption. By the opening weeks of 1945, when U.S. divisions prepared to retake Leyte, the groundwork was complete. Bridges would no longer simply connect points A and B. They would control, trap, and eliminate enemy forces. And Japanese commanders, blinded by tradition and expectation, were about to discover just how lethal American engineering could be. The stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine the role of infrastructure in warfare, transforming bridges from neutral pathways into instruments of strategic shock, an innovation that would leave Japanese officers stunned and alter the course of the Pacific Campaign. By early 1945, the U.S. military had developed a new philosophy of warfare in the Pacific. Every element of the environment could be turned to advantage. Rivers, roads, and especially bridges were no longer passive elements of terrain. They became weapons in their own right. The dense jungles and wide rivers of the Philippines presented both obstacles and opportunities. For Japanese commanders, bridges were simple, utilitarian structures, pathways for reinforcements, supply convoys, and retreating units. For American forces, they were tactical tools capable of reshaping the battlefield. Engineers meticulously surveyed every crossing in advance. Each bridge was evaluated not only for its structural integrity, but for how it could be rigged to disrupt enemy movement. Some were reinforced to support limited Allied crossings, while secretly fitted with charges set to collapse once Japanese troops had advanced over them. Others were altered subtly to mislead enemy reconnaissance. Sections weakened to fail under weight, hidden triggers designed to detonate after delay. The goal was not merely destruction, it was control. Bridges could funnel Japanese forces into kill zones, isolate units from reinforcements, and create chaos in enemy ranks. The psychological element was equally critical. Japanese troops were trained to anticipate conventional artillery and infantry assaults, but not ingenuity applied to infrastructure. Commanders relied on established routines and predictable logistics, assuming the Americans would attack directly or from the air. By using bridges as weapons, U.S. forces exploited this expectation. A single destroyed bridge could cut off an entire battalion, disrupt supply lines, and create confusion far beyond the immediate physical damage. Intelligence reports from Leyte indicate Japanese officers repeatedly underestimated the strategic possibilities of bridges, viewing them as static objects rather than dynamic tools. American units integrated these tactics into broader operational planning. Reconnaissance teams marked enemy movements, engineering units prepared demolition and rigging, and infantry coordinated attacks to coincide with the exploitation of bridge collapses. On several occasions, false crossings and decoy bridges were constructed, drawing Japanese forces into ambushes while leaving critical points under Allied control. Bridges became tactical chess pieces. A collapse here, a trap there, a diversion that reshaped the flow of an entire engagement. The effectiveness of this strategy relied on precise timing, communication, and coordination. Engineers communicated with frontline commanders to ensure charges were detonated at optimal moments, exploiting currents, troop formations, and Japanese defensive positions. Explosives were concealed in beams, supports, and decking, engineered to fail progressively, creating both physical and psychological shock. Japanese units approaching a river could find the first crossing intact, only to watch the second collapse beneath their weight, isolating them and creating chaos across the battlefield. This method was not limited to large bridges. Smaller wooden structures, once overlooked, became deadly tools when reinforced or rigged with explosive charges. American ingenuity turned even minor crossings into instruments of tactical leverage, magnifying their impact on enemy movements. Reports from forward observers note Japanese soldiers pausing, uncertain of the safety of each step, their morale eroding under the realization that familiar terrain was no longer safe. By mid-January 1945, the implementation of these strategies was underway. On Leyte, U.S. forces systematically integrated bridge operations into river assaults, exploiting both the physical destruction of crossings and the resulting psychological effect. Japanese commanders, watching from observation posts, could not comprehend the dual use of these structures, simultaneously facilitating their own movements and serving as instruments of their defeat. The anticipation of conventional combat clashed with the reality of American innovation, producing shock and disarray among Japanese ranks. These operations foreshadowed a larger lesson for the Pacific War. Innovation often mattered as much as firepower. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized overwhelming force and predictable supply lines, the Americans demonstrated that adaptability, engineering skill, and strategic foresight could bend the environment itself to their will. Bridges, once neutral passages, had become decisive weapons. And in the coming battles, their impact would be measured not just in timber and steel lost, but in the stunned faces of commanders watching their forces falter. The stage was now fully set. Japanese officers would soon confront the full effect of these tactics, a combination of ingenuity, timing, and audacity that would redefine the battlefield and set the tone for the decisive confrontations to follow. The human dimension of warfare often defines how strategy unfolds in ways that plans alone cannot predict. On Leyte, January 1945, soldiers on both sides were forced to confront the unfamiliar. Japanese troops, trained for frontal assaults and disciplined in defensive positioning, approached rivers and bridges with the confidence born of routine. Bridges had always represented safe passage. They were predictable, dependable, almost neutral. Yet, as American forces had meticulously prepared, that confidence was about to be shattered. For the infantry, the psychological shock was immediate. Japanese soldiers advancing across a bridge, seeing the river beneath them, expected only the natural hazards of terrain. Instead, the structure itself seemed to betray them. Timed detonations reduced sections to splinters, sending troops plunging into rushing waters. Panic rippled through ranks trained for order and cohesion. In some instances, units became trapped between destroyed bridges and advancing Allied forces, their retreat cut off. Eyewitness accounts describe men frozen in disbelief, officers shouting orders that could not be executed, and the slow realization that the battlefield itself had turned against them. On the American side, engineering units and infantry shared a sense of both anticipation and responsibility. Soldiers watched the culmination of their painstaking preparation as bridges were detonated at precise moments. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and Japanese forces would avoid the trap. Too late, and American troops risked advancing into unmanageable chaos. The coordination demanded not only technical skill, but emotional discipline. Engineers crouched in hidden positions, wires and charges at the ready, hearts pounding with the weight of potential consequences. The success of the operation depended as much on calm, nerves, as on calculation, merging human endurance with mechanical precision. Tactically, the American approach reshaped the battlefield. Bridges became force multipliers rather than mere pathways. By collapsing key crossings, engineers could isolate Japanese units from reinforcements, cut off supply lines, and funnel enemy forces into pre-selected kill zones. Infantry advancing behind these maneuvers found resistance easier to anticipate and manage. The physical terrain had been subtly rewritten, with rivers, destroyed crossings, and debris creating channels that dictated movement and dictated outcomes. Commanders relied on precise timing. Artillery suppressed enemy positions while bridges were rigged for destruction, and small teams ensured that escape routes for Japanese troops were limited. The tactical implications extended beyond immediate combat. Destroyed bridges slowed Japanese resupply and reinforcements across the island, forcing commanders to rethink strategies they had previously considered reliable. A bridge collapse that stopped a single convoy could ripple through the operational network, creating shortages of ammunition, food, and medical support. Every explosion became not just an act of destruction, but a calculated manipulation of enemy logistics. The ripple effects on morale were equally profound. Japanese soldiers, trained to expect linear, predictable operations, were confronted with chaos born not of superior firepower, but of ingenuity. Human experience on the ground was inseparable from these tactical considerations. Soldiers saw bridges as symbols of security. When that symbol failed, it shook confidence in the leadership that had guided them. Officers reported confusion, hesitation, and fear among troops navigating rivers where familiar landmarks had been transformed into hazards. American forces, meanwhile, felt the dual pressures of executing complex engineering operations under fire while maintaining offensive momentum. The tension between precision and improvisation was constant, requiring vigilance, discipline, and trust in both planning and fellow soldiers. The combination of human psychology and tactical innovation created an almost theatrical effect on the battlefield. Japanese commanders, observing from nearby vantage points, were stunned not only by the physical destruction, but by the calculated orchestration behind it. Bridges were no longer neutral. They were active participants in the conflict. Soldiers' fear, hesitation, and confusion magnified the tactical advantages of the Americans, turning small engineering operations into decisive elements of the campaign. These experiences reveal a deeper truth about warfare. The most lethal weapons are not always guns or artillery, but the capacity to manipulate perception, expectation, and terrain. The interplay of human response and tactical ingenuity transformed every crossing into a potential turning point. And for Japanese troops who had relied on tradition and routine, the realization that the battlefield itself could betray them was a shock that would echo throughout the campaign. In the next perspective, we will explore how technological innovation, leadership decisions, and enemy miscalculations converge to amplify the impact of these bridge operations, turning a simple structure into a decisive instrument of war. While human and tactical factors define the immediate battlefield experience, the backbone of these operations lay in technological innovation. American engineers approached bridges not as passive structures, but as mechanisms to be manipulated, altered, and weaponized. Explosives were not simply attached to surfaces. They were integrated into the very architecture of each crossing. Steel girders were weakened at calculated points. Wooden decking was rigged to collapse progressively, and concealed detonators allowed controlled destruction synchronized with infantry and artillery movements. Some bridges were even reinforced in selective areas to support Allied movement, while destabilizing others under enemy weight. A subtle but deadly combination of construction and sabotage. Innovations extended beyond demolition. Reconnaissance units employed portable surveying equipment to measure load limits and structural weaknesses. Engineers developed specialized charges that could create maximum damage with minimal explosive, preserving key terrain for future operations. In dense jungle or mountainous terrain, small wooden footbridges, previously ignored, became crucial tools in tactical planning. Every crossing was analyzed as a potential weapon, a consideration that forced American units to rethink traditional concepts of firepower and logistics. The interplay of engineering and strategy transformed bridges from mere utility into instruments of precise, lethal control. Leadership decisions were equally critical in executing this innovation. Commanders like General Douglas MacArthur and his subordinates understood that battlefield ingenuity required both vision and discipline. Orders were precise. Engineers were to work in concert with infantry, artillery, and air support to maximize the psychological and physical impact of each bridge operation. Coordination meetings were meticulous, with commanders reviewing every map, every river crossing, and every potential Japanese route. In field reports, American officers emphasized patience and timing over brute force, recognizing that the shock effect of a destroyed bridge could produce greater results than a frontal assault. On the Japanese side, leadership faced unprecedented challenges. Commanders were accustomed to rapid advances, clear lines of communication, and predictable logistics. The weaponization of bridges disrupted all three. Units trapped between collapsed crossings and advancing American forces found no immediate guidance from their officers. Intelligence had failed to anticipate the dual use of infrastructure. Japanese commanders struggled to comprehend why standard defensive positions were failing despite numerical advantage and well-trained troops. Memoirs and post-war analyses highlight repeated disbelief. How could a simple bridge, a structure built for transport, have such a decisive influence on the outcome of a battle? Enemy miscalculations extended beyond leadership. Field intelligence underestimated the Americans' capacity for innovation. Patrols and reconnaissance often reported bridges as secure, based solely on structural soundness and traffic patterns, failing to detect hidden explosives or rigged weaknesses. This overconfidence made Japanese movements predictable, exactly what the Americans relied upon. Entire units were funneled into traps, suffering casualties not from superior weaponry, but from a combination of deception, timing, and engineering ingenuity. Even experienced officers admitted that their planning could not account for infrastructure transformed into a weapon, a tactical evolution that challenged conventional military thinking. Technology, leadership, and enemy miscalculations intersected in a single principle: control the environment, and you control the battle. Bridges exemplified this principle. Every demolition charge, every reinforcement, every calculated misdirection was the product of coordinated leadership and technological expertise. American forces did not merely destroy, they choreographed. Japanese officers, facing the unexpected, reacted in confusion, struggling to adapt under pressure. The battlefield became a landscape where human ingenuity and mechanical precision dictated outcomes more decisively than massed troops or firepower alone. In essence, the weaponization of bridges was a lesson in multidimensional warfare. Human psychology, tactical planning, engineering innovation, and leadership decisions combined to amplify impact. The shock felt by Japanese commanders was not just physical. It was intellectual and emotional. A single, carefully prepared bridge could produce effects that echoed across entire divisions, altering morale, strategy, and the tempo of operations. This convergence of factors set the stage for the climax, where American bridge operations would fully manifest their destructive and strategic potential, leaving Japanese forces stunned and altering the course of the campaign. January 17, 1945. Dawn broke over the rivers of Leyte with a gray, misty light. American engineers and infantry moved silently through mud-soaked trails, their equipment camouflaged beneath brush and timber. Across the water, Japanese forces maintained their positions along bridges they considered secure, unaware that these structures were no longer neutral passages. Each bridge had been transformed into a weapon, a lethal trap timed to the second. The first engagement occurred at a narrow steel and wood bridge spanning the Catoctin River. Japanese reinforcements had begun crossing, confident in the structural integrity and strategic necessity of the passage. American engineers had installed explosive charges within key supports, designed to fail only when the bridge bore the full weight of enemy soldiers and vehicles. As the Japanese column advanced, the bridge groaned, shuddered, and then fractured with a deafening roar. Men plunged into the icy river below, tangled in beams and debris. Panic rippled through the remaining ranks, and officers struggled to organize a retreat under relentless American fire from concealed positions along the riverbank. Simultaneously, a second engagement unfolded on a wooden footbridge near the village of Burauen. Here, a smaller unit of Japanese soldiers attempted a reconnaissance crossing, unaware that the Americans had rigged the bridge with progressive charges. The initial detonation collapsed the middle supports, leaving the front and rear sections temporarily intact. Soldiers froze in disbelief, trapped on either side, while American infantry opened fire from nearby positions. The combination of physical destruction and psychological shock proved devastating. Trained troops became disoriented, abandoning coordination in the face of unexpected chaos. American leadership had orchestrated these operations with precision. Brigades were instructed to advance only after engineers confirmed the readiness of each bridge trap. Coordination with artillery ensured that Japanese forces attempting alternative crossings were suppressed, limiting their options. Explosives were timed with exacting detail, often synchronized with the tide and current of rivers, to maximize casualties and disruption. The battlefield became a controlled environment, where each collapse of timber and steel was a calculated strike rather than an act of chance. The tactical impact extended beyond immediate casualties. Japanese units found their reinforcement lines severed, supply convoys halted, and retreat options restricted. Commanders scrambled to adapt, issuing orders to redirect troops to alternative crossings, only to find that many had also been rigged or were under observation by American marksmen. Bridges, once thought mundane and predictable, dictated the flow of the battle. Every crossing became a crucible where leadership, timing, and planning determined survival or destruction. In the chaos of these initial engagements, the psychological toll on Japanese soldiers was evident. Soldiers who had trained for frontal assaults and defensive maneuvers now confronted terrain that actively worked against them. Fear, confusion, and hesitation slowed movements, leaving units exposed to combined arms fire. Field reports later recounted officers shaking their heads in disbelief, witnessing the systematic collapse of positions they had assumed secure. The Americans had not merely attacked, they had rewritten the rules of engagement. Elsewhere on Leyte, American units exploited similar tactics across multiple river crossings. Engineers coordinated successive demolitions, ensuring that Japanese reinforcements could not consolidate. Infantry advanced in tandem, exploiting the disorientation caused by collapsing bridges. Each detonation produced a ripple effect, forcing Japanese commanders to constantly reassess their strategy under pressure. What might have been a straightforward defensive posture became a series of reactive maneuvers, each dictated by the environment the Americans had engineered. By mid-morning, the battlefield had transformed. Bridges, rivers, and trails, all previously neutral or supportive terrain, had become instruments of control. The initial shock left Japanese forces disoriented, their defensive plans unraveling under the weight of ingenuity and timing. The Americans, in contrast, advanced methodically, their operations a testament to planning, engineering, and the deliberate exploitation of the enemy's expectations. This sequence of events set the stage for the decisive moments that would define the campaign. The full effect of weaponized bridges was about to be realized, and Japanese commanders, stunned and disoriented, faced a turning point that would determine not only the outcome of the battle, but the tempo of the entire Leyte campaign. By late afternoon on January 17, 1945, the cumulative effects of American bridge operations became unmistakable. Along the central river corridor of Leyte, multiple Japanese units found their planned reinforcements halted in mid-movement. Bridges, once reliable conduits, now dictated the battlefield. Columns of soldiers were trapped between collapsed spans and advancing American infantry, unable to retreat or consolidate. Artillery fire targeted escape routes, while engineers prepared secondary demolitions to prevent regrouping. What began as a series of calculated ambushes had evolved into a decisive operational advantage. At the Tigbayo River crossing, one of the largest steel bridges in the area, the Americans executed a particularly effective operation. Engineers had partially weakened support beams in advance, leaving them capable of bearing weight temporarily. As Japanese tanks and trucks attempted to cross, timed detonations tore the structure apart. Vehicles plunged into the water, rolling over one another, and soldiers scrambled on the banks, disoriented and exposed. The combination of destruction and psychological shock caused units to fragment entirely. Reports later described commanders shouting orders that could not be executed as troops panicked or retreated into unsafe positions. Simultaneously, smaller engagements at secondary crossings amplified the impact. Footbridges and wooden trestles, which Japanese planners had considered minor, were transformed into traps. Detonations triggered sequentially, creating confusion over which routes were safe. Soldiers hesitated at every crossing, disrupting the rhythm of Japanese defense and slowing reinforcements to a crawl. American infantry, advancing behind this engineered chaos, capitalized on the delay. Skirmishes that might have resulted in prolonged stalemates ended quickly, as disoriented Japanese units failed to mount coordinated resistance. The leadership element proved equally decisive. Japanese commanders, confronted with the repeated destruction of key infrastructure, attempted to reroute units and repair damaged bridges. Communications were strained. Some officers underestimated the Americans' ability to coordinate simultaneous operations across multiple crossings. Miscalculations compounded panic in the field. Meanwhile, American commanders monitored the unfolding chaos, directing artillery, infantry, and engineering teams with precision. Each bridge collapse was leveraged to maximize disruption, and each subsequent maneuver further destabilized Japanese defensive lines. By early evening, the operational consequences were clear. The Japanese had suffered significant casualties, including both personnel and vehicles. Entire battalions were effectively neutralized or forced into positions where regrouping was impossible. Supply lines were fractured, delaying reinforcements for the following days. Psychological impact mirrored the physical destruction. Soldiers were demoralized, hesitant, and increasingly cautious, knowing that each river crossing could be a death trap. The Americans had not merely won ground. They had dictated the tempo and geography of the battlefield itself. Eyewitness accounts capture the stunned realization among Japanese officers. One field report noted, "The bridges, they move against us. We cannot trust the terrain. Every crossing is a threat." Another officer described troops refusing to advance, fearing hidden detonations. This reaction underscored the dual nature of the tactic. It was as much psychological as it was physical. The battlefield was no longer defined solely by firepower or troop numbers, but by ingenuity, anticipation, and controlled disruption. By nightfall, American forces had secured several key crossings, effectively isolating Japanese units across Leyte. The destruction of bridges created a network of forced bottlenecks, guiding enemy movements into predictable zones and allowing the Allies to exploit weaknesses with devastating effect. Casualty estimates indicate that hundreds of Japanese soldiers were lost to collapsed bridges and subsequent infantry engagements, while additional units were immobilized, further weakening defensive capabilities. This decisive use of infrastructure marked a turning point in the Leyte campaign. The Americans had demonstrated that strategic innovation could redefine the battlefield. Bridges, once neutral elements of movement, became lethal instruments of control. Japanese commanders, confronted by the unexpected, were forced into reactionary measures that consistently failed to counter the Americans' methodical execution. By the end of the day, the advantage was unmistakable. The battlefield had shifted, not through overwhelming numbers, but through ingenuity, timing, and engineering mastery. The events of January 17th would echo across subsequent operations, shaping both the tactics and mindset of Japanese forces in the Philippines. The stage was now set for the aftermath. The consequences of these operations on both physical terrain and human morale, and how they reshaped the broader strategy of the Pacific Campaign. The dawn after January 17, 1945, revealed a battlefield profoundly altered. Bridges that had once symbolized safe passage now lay in splintered ruin, rivers clogged with debris, and currents swollen with twisted metal and fallen soldiers. The immediate consequences for Japanese forces were catastrophic. Hundreds of men had been killed or injured in collapsing structures, while countless others were immobilized on the wrong side of rivers, cut off from reinforcements or retreat. Units that had been prepared to counterattack found themselves isolated, their cohesion shattered by both physical destruction and psychological shock. Supply lines suffered just as severely. Trucks, ammunition convoys, and essential rations had been halted or destroyed by collapsing bridges. Japanese commanders faced the grim reality that their logistical network, critical for sustaining frontline operations, was in disarray. Engineers attempted hurried repairs, but American artillery and infantry, familiar with the terrain and timing of each collapse, made restoration dangerous and often impossible. In the span of a single morning, what had been a predictable defensive infrastructure became a network of vulnerabilities, undermining months of planning. The human toll extended beyond casualties. Japanese soldiers, conditioned to rely on discipline and structured movements, were forced to confront the unfamiliar, a battlefield in which the environment itself acted as an adversary. Accounts from survivors described the bewilderment and fear of troops crossing partially intact bridges, unsure if they would support their weight, and officers struggling to maintain command over panicked soldiers. Morale plummeted, and hesitation became as damaging as bullets. One post-war report noted that Japanese units hesitated at every river, as if the very land itself had turned against them. American forces, in contrast, emerged with both tactical and psychological advantages. Engineers who had prepared the bridge demolitions received direct reports of success, confirming the precision of their planning. Infantry and artillery units moved across cleared areas with minimal resistance, exploiting gaps created by destroyed crossings. The operation showcased the effectiveness of combining engineering expertise with battlefield timing. A calculated sequence of collapses produced results far greater than conventional assaults could achieve. The immediate battlefield outcome was unmistakable. Key crossings along Leyte's central rivers were under American control, while Japanese defensive formations were fragmented. Casualty estimates suggest that hundreds were killed in bridge collapses alone, with additional losses from subsequent infantry engagements. The destruction of transport routes delayed reinforcements for critical Japanese units, forcing them to reroute across more hazardous terrain. Each destroyed bridge acted as a choke point, shaping enemy movement and providing American forces with a sustained operational advantage. Even within surviving Japanese units, the shock of these events reverberated. Commanders convened emergency meetings to attempt damage control, reassigning troops and trying to stabilize fronts that had collapsed under the unexpected weaponization of infrastructure. Communications were slow, morale was low, and confidence in previously secure positions was shattered. Soldiers on the ground began to question the reliability of familiar terrain, a psychological impact that magnified the tactical success of the American operation. The immediate aftermath of these bridge operations left an unmistakable imprint on the Leyte campaign. Beyond casualties and destroyed infrastructure, the Americans had proven the potency of innovative tactics, demonstrating that battlefield control could extend beyond firepower and numbers to include environmental manipulation. For Japanese forces, the experience marked a profound shock, a moment where predictability, routine, and traditional strategy were rendered ineffective by ingenuity and precise execution. The stage was now set for the broader consequences, the strategic, operational, and psychological ripple effects that would reshape the Pacific campaign in the weeks and months to come. The tactical success of bridge operations on Leyte rippled far beyond immediate casualties and disrupted supply lines. Strategically, the Americans had gained a decisive advantage that altered the tempo and direction of the campaign. By neutralizing key crossings, U.S. forces effectively controlled movement across the island. Japanese units, once mobile and coordinated, were now confined to predictable pathways, vulnerable to ambushes and artillery fire. This control allowed American commanders to advance methodically, prioritizing positions that maximized operational leverage while minimizing unnecessary exposure to risk. Japanese strategic planning suffered a fundamental blow. Bridges, which had previously facilitated rapid troop movements and flexible defensive maneuvers, could no longer be relied upon. Commanders were forced to reroute convoys over longer, more hazardous routes or attempt improvised crossings under fire. The delay of reinforcements disrupted the synchronization of counterattacks, leaving isolated units vulnerable. Historical reports from the Philippine campaign note that such disruptions contributed directly to the collapse of defensive cohesion, as Japanese forces struggled to adapt to a battlefield where every crossing was suspect and every movement constrained by environmental traps. The psychological impact on Japanese soldiers and commanders was equally profound. Soldiers began to view rivers, roads, and bridges, once neutral or even familiar terrain, as unpredictable hazards. Fear and hesitation spread through the ranks, diminishing offensive initiative and eroding confidence in leadership. Officers confronted with the repeated failure of conventional tactics against unconventional engineering questioned their planning and intelligence assessments. Morale plummeted in units that had previously relied on discipline, training, and cohesion to withstand the intensity of American assaults. The realization that infrastructure itself could be turned against them left many feeling exposed, vulnerable, and disoriented. American forces, conversely, experienced a significant boost in morale and confidence. The success of coordinated engineering operations demonstrated the effectiveness of innovation, planning, and precise execution. Soldiers and commanders alike saw that battlefield ingenuity could achieve results disproportionate to manpower alone. This reinforced the importance of integrating engineering, intelligence, and infantry operations, a principle that would continue to guide Allied campaigns across the Pacific. Bridges, once considered minor logistical concerns, emerged as a symbol of strategic creativity and operational dominance. Long-term, the psychological and strategic effects extended beyond Leyte. Japanese planners, witnessing the success of American tactics, became increasingly cautious in subsequent campaigns. Predictable routines were abandoned, movements slowed, and commanders hesitated to commit forces without assurances of safe crossings. While this caution reduced immediate casualties, it also limited operational flexibility and ceded initiative to the Americans, who could exploit hesitation and control key terrain. In essence, the weaponization of bridges reshaped the Japanese approach to infrastructure, forcing a defensive mindset that emphasized survival over proactive engagement. The broader Pacific Campaign would continue to reflect these lessons. American forces increasingly incorporated engineering innovations into island assaults. Rivers were analyzed as tactical elements rather than mere obstacles, and unconventional approaches became central to operational planning. Bridges, and the lessons they embodied, became a template for exploiting both terrain and enemy expectation. The success on Leyte demonstrated that the environment itself could be weaponized, not by chance, but through deliberate planning, timing, and coordination. By the end of January 1945, the immediate chaos of destroyed crossings had settled, but its consequences endured. Japanese units were disoriented, morale shaken, and supply lines fractured, while American forces advanced with newfound momentum and confidence. The battlefield had been fundamentally reshaped, demonstrating that innovation, precision, and foresight could redefine the course of engagements and leave a lasting imprint on strategy, psychology, and the outcome of war. The stage was now set for reflection. The events on Leyte, from the ingenuity of bridge operations to the shock they inflicted on Japanese commanders, offer a lens through which to consider the broader implications of warfare. How creativity, human resilience, and adaptation can transform seemingly ordinary elements of the environment into instruments of strategic power. In the quiet that followed the chaos on Leyte, the battlefield bore witness to more than physical destruction. Bridges, once simple structures of utility, had become instruments of ingenuity and shock, turning terrain itself into a weapon. The Americans had demonstrated that warfare was not solely a contest of numbers, firepower, or courage, but also of creativity and anticipation. The psychological toll on Japanese soldiers, the disruption of supply lines, and the fragmentation of command underscored a fundamental truth. Control over the environment could define victory as decisively as bullets or bombs. The Leyte campaign illustrates the evolving nature of conflict in the Pacific theater. American forces did not simply attack, they engineered outcomes. Timing, coordination, and an understanding of human psychology transformed predictable terrain into unpredictable danger. Bridges were no longer neutral pathways. They were strategic tools, capable of shaping enemy behavior, slowing reinforcements, and dictating the flow of combat. For Japanese commanders, who had relied on routine, discipline, and conventional strategy, the experience was both humbling and alarming. Beyond the immediate tactical and operational impact, the events offer a broader reflection on warfare and human ingenuity. Innovation often emerges not in laboratories or factories alone, but on the battlefield itself, where creativity meets necessity. The simple act of turning a bridge into a weapon demonstrates how small, deliberate interventions can have consequences disproportionate to their scale, reshaping the environment, morale, and strategy simultaneously. As rivers flowed through shattered spans and soldiers navigated the aftermath of destruction, the lessons of Leyte endured. Warfare is not static. Structures, terrain, and expectation are all malleable. Victory belongs to those who can perceive opportunity, anticipate behavior, and wield ingenuity as decisively as a rifle or artillery shell. In the end, The shock felt by Japanese commanders was not merely the destruction of bridges. It was the realization that the rules of war themselves could be rewritten, and that even the most ordinary element of the landscape could become a weapon in the hands of those who dared to see differently.